Welcome once again to Decluttering 55 Plus with Michelle Passoff. I'm Michelle Passoff. This is the place to come for news you can use to get things done without anything in the way on the road ahead. When you think of cleaning clutter, the first thing that comes to mind is probably cleaning up a messy desk or an overflowing closet. Or how about that garage you can't even get into? Here we talk about those things, but that's not all. Here we stretch the definition of clutter. The things that confound, confuse, and stop us from moving ahead in life are clutter. We clean up those areas by bringing them out from under the carpet into the light of day, where we can talk about them, learn new things, get inspired, get in action, and get things done. Without anything in the way, we're free, and anything is possible. Let's invigorate our lives and create a legacy, not a mess. We will look at our health and fitness, digital decluttering, and where we will move and what we will do next in life. We will examine our relationships, our financial and legal life, and even consider making our own final arrangements. Yes, indeed, nothing is off the table. Today, we're going to talk about writing our life stories because when you meet our next guest, you will hear all about the merit of doing so. Richard Stone is a leading authority on storytelling and the author of The Healing Art of Storytelling and Story Intelligence. He is the CEO of StoryWork International, where he is a consultant to leading organizations and corporations. I met Richard more than 20 years ago on a ferry from Block Island in Rhode Island, and I'm happy to host him on this podcast today so he can tell us everything he knows about the ins and outs of sharing your life story. Welcome, Richard. Let's jump right in, Richard. First, tell us why telling our life story is important and what does it bring to future generations?
Well, there's a lot being spoken about today about isolation and loneliness. We spend a lot of time alone, and we know that that has terrible consequences for us mentally and physically. It can be equivalent to like smoking a pack of cigarettes a day or something like that. I mean, that's how deleterious it is to our health. We need to be in connection with other people. And, even David Brooks has just come out with a new wonderful book, about how do we get to know others. And he says, fundamentally, it's about listening to their stories and taking time just to connect. And so we desperately need the connection. And there's no better way to do that than to sit down with someone and say, hey, where did you come from? And where were you born? Who were your parents? Who were you? Did your parents, did their parents come from Europe or where did they, are you Africa or South America? And, next thing you know, people are telling their story. So we need that connectivity. And storytelling is the currency of that.
So a lot of people might say, I'm not a writer, I'm not a storyteller. How do they even start to begin to know and create their stories?
Well, first of all, no, we're not all writers. But actually, I think we are all storytellers. Storytelling is the language. It's fundamental to being a human being. Now, we don't think of ourselves as storytellers often. I was doing some work years ago with a pediatric clinic out in Salt Lake City. And, many of the people I would sit down with to ask them to tell their story. And I had one person, she was the receptionist. She says, oh, I'm nobody. I'm not important. And it turned out that she was pivotal in helping a young girl who turned out she had diabetes and almost died, but because through her intercession as the receptionist, and she suddenly changed her whole perspective in the telling of that story. So we don't think of ourselves as storytellers, but we're doing it all the time, all day long. We're doing it in our dreams, while we're sleeping. We're telling stories all the time, and we don't think of it as that because we often sort of say, oh, it has to be some kind of perfect piece of work or artwork or something. It doesn't have to be that. It's just in the natural sharing of life experiences. How was your work today? What happened? Oh, you should have seen what happened on the interstate today. Oh my gosh, this car went flying over the other car. That's telling a story. Yeah.
How do you develop that skill? Sometimes I can't even remember what happened yesterday, no less what happened to my childhood.
Yeah. So, our memories sometimes, fail us. And, if you say, write down your stories or tell me your stories. You go, I'm not sure. So it's often in prompts that can specifically elicit a memory. So if I say, who was your best friend, Michelle, when you were growing up, in elementary school? You go, oh yeah, there was, so-and-so. You'll remember that, right?
It's funny that you should mention that, because all my life I thought Lisa Cohn was my best friend growing up. And through Facebook, I got back in touch with her and I found out that she thought Gene Arensky was her best friend. So it could be disappointing.
Yeah. So, it wasn't exactly what you thought it was, but, for you at the time, she was the best friend.
I was devastated.
Questions. Yeah. I said, do you remember, a memorable vacation you went on with your parents? Oh, yeah, it was that time we went to the Grand Canyon. But, some of that stuff just sort of gets lost until we kind of, pull it back out of the, the cellar of our memories. And so it takes often specific kinds of prompts to help us start to recall things. And it's helpful to have another person, a listener.
Oh, that's interesting.
Storytelling requires a good listener. So, often people say, I gave my grandma a recorder and told her to record her stories. Or I said, you should write your stories down, Grandma. And it never happened because Grandma needs someone right across the table there who's interested, who's responding, who's reacting, and go, oh my gosh, tell me more about that. And that's the thing that really brings it out in us, is in that kind of there's a whole thing called limbic resonance, and there's something that happens between two people that doesn't happen when we're by ourselves.
So even when you're telling your life story to somebody else verbally, and you're recording that, it can be translated into the written word. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, and I have a dear friend here who lives in Athens. He's retired there, Athens, Georgia. And over a period of weeks, we sat just like this, and I collected all of his stories, and then I had them transcribed. And then he could edit them. There's wonderful AI programs now that you can just send your recording off to, and within moments, it'll transcribe the recording. And sometimes there's some words that kind of get lost in translation. You got to go clean it up. And it's not ready for publication, but it's ready to be edited. So that often's easier for people because the speaking is easier than writing. And then you can go do the cleanup afterwards if you want a written document, for example.
Do you think it's good to tell your story by going back in time and chronologically going from childhood to your college years to your working life to your retirement, or are there other sequences that you should think of?
Well, I think there's two fundamental ways you can do it. You can do it chronologically and work your way up in time from your early childhood through your teen years and your first work experiences and early relationship experiences, etc. Or you can do it thematically.
What would a theme be, for example?
Theme could be jealousy. Were you ever jealous of anybody? And maybe, you were jealous of your, a good friend when you were 8 years old, and maybe when you were 25 years old in your first job because somebody was always getting, the plum assignments. So you could take a theme like jealousy or betrayal. This is the stuff of soap operas, right? But this is the stuff of life. And human emotions.
You bring up a good point. The perspective from which you should write. If somebody doesn't have self-esteem and they said, "Oh, I was a loser in my life," and they tell their whole story through, the the thought about themselves that they were less than. Yeah. How before somebody sets out to write their life story, do you need an attitude adjustment about yourself?
Well, that's a good question. I think in the process of telling one's stories, one might discover value and worth in their life that they didn't realize was there. And so, I years ago, I was doing some work with adult children of alcoholics. And, one of the exercises I often do in workshops is draw the floor plan of the house you grew up in. And, just sort of indicate where the furniture was, this is where the bed was, you just draw it in. And there's something in the physicality of drawing that elicits memories. But I said, a lot of these people didn't have good memories growing up. Dad was violent, or when he was drinking. And I said, if there's rooms in that house you don't want to go to, that's fine. If you don't want to do the exercise, I understand. What was interesting is that one person said, in drawing this, I remembered a Christmas when Dad wasn't drinking, and how great that experience. And so what we often do with our past is we paint it with a broad brush. I'm a worthless person, or I never had, my father was an awful person, whatever, and I never got what I needed. And something in the specificity of telling the stories is we discover it's more nuanced than that our life has got ups and downs and had good things and bad things. And it's not all one, gray color that you can paint it with a big broad brush. It has texture. It has context. And so in the telling of stories, we often discover things about ourselves and about our life experiences that is richer than the story we tell that I'm a worthless person. That's, that kind of a broad judgment about oneself. You suddenly find, there were times when maybe I did things worthwhile. Maybe that was a story I took in from my parents that they always told. My dad always said I was worthless, and I believed it until you suddenly discover in the telling of the stories that there are times where you were appreciated by people, and and so now you have a counterbalance.
I wouldn't think that you want to hand down to future generations that you had a worthless grandfather. So,
well, this is a complicated thing about the past, and if you had a father, and maybe your children, it's always interesting. You may have had a terrible experience with your father, but the grandkids loved him.
Yeah,
they had a different experience with him. They had an entirely different experience with him. So, I think it's okay to hand down that grandfather was a complicated person. And maybe have some compassion for grandfather, because what was his childhood like? What experiences did he grow up with that turned him into this hardened person who was always bitter? So,
are there secrets you shouldn't tell, or is it harmful in any way to share your stories?
Well, that's a good question. There was a secret in my family. I was thinking about this because you posed the question before we met. When I was 5 years old, my grandfather died, and I was told that he had a heart attack. This is my father's father. And I have he lived in St. Louis, and I saw him very irregularly, but I had really fond memories of this man. And years go by. I'm in Chicago. I've moved to Chicago to study painting. I'm sitting with my cousin watching her boyfriend play softball. We're in the bleachers, and I'm staying at their house temporarily till I find housing. And she says, "Oh, you're staying in the room where Grandpa hung himself."
Oh, goodness.
And I almost fell out of the bleachers. I said, "What are you talking about?" And it turned out he had committed suicide in his son's house at age 65. This was such a heavy thing to carry. It took me quite a few years. I wanted to talk to my father. I didn't know how to talk about it because it felt so loaded. And finally, at some point, my mother had already died, and I went over to visit my father. And it's like, I waited till almost the last minute. We went out for a little walk or something. I said, "Dad, tell me, and he had no memory that we were told that he had a heart attack. But what do you tell a 5-year-old child, and this is in the 50s, that someone's committed suicide, which is such a difficult subject?
Were you angry with him you could perceive that as lying.
I didn't feel angry. I felt relieved just to know that he didn't know. No one knew why he was so depressed. Who knows in those days what, people didn't have any understanding of mental health and depression and to understand the early signs of that. I think his business had just failed. Who knows what was going on? But it was important to have it out, to have it in the open. And so I think things that are kept in secret, they build a valence, a strong power. And I think when they're suddenly revealed, they suddenly, there are some things there are awful things that people have done in their lives, and And maybe they're not appropriate necessarily to share with their children, and I think that's an interesting choice that someone has to make about their mistakes that they've made in their life.
So is there anything more that you want to say about how to decide what to put in your story and what to leave out?
Well, I think that's what's instructive is to think about, there's 4 kinds of reminiscence that could be useful here. One is simple reminiscence. It's just fond memories. And those are really valuable. Your best friend and things you used to do as a child, those kinds of simple things that are just fond memories. But there's also a thing called instrumental reminiscence, which is about challenges we've faced and gotten through. Those stories are invaluable for the next generation. The third kind of reminiscence is transmissive. And that says, what are our values? What are the things that we want to pass on that are not material? And it's in our stories of things that we've faced that can encode our values that we may want to share. And there's a thing called an ethical will in the Jewish tradition, which your listeners might want to go look into. It's a wonderful tool for passing on those stories. And the last is what I would call integrative reminiscence, which is all about how do we put it all together into a cohesive whole. And often when I've been talking with older people, they go, maybe they came from the old country and they go, oh, we don't want to talk about that. It was awful. The Cossacks came riding in every 2 weeks to kill people. And but integrative reminiscence is how do we take everything in our life and include it in the whole? Because even the bad experiences have created partly who we are, and I think by embracing them, they no longer have power over us.
So one way or the other, whether you choose to do it audio, video, writing, and the method in which let this conversation just be a starter and take a look into it and be sure to pass along your experiences and wisdoms to the next generation. That's all we have time for today. So we're going to stop the conversation by encouraging you to consider doing your life story. You can create your legacy, not a mess, by sharing your experiences and wisdoms. Thank you for joining us today, Richard Stone, author of The Healing Art of Storytelling and Storytelling Intelligence. We would love for you to be in touch with us to share your comments and questions. Let us know what topics you want us to cover on this podcast and what your challenges and personal stories of success are. Visit our website at www.decluttering55plus.com and go to the Let's Connect page to send your message. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, subscribe to us on YouTube, and by all means, rate us on this podcast platform so we can build this community and keep the conversation going. Thank you for joining us today and have a clutter-free day.